Good day. You're about to hear some stories that occurred in this area south of Quebec City years ago. It's a joint effort between Coirnéal Cealteach, our organization from the South Shore here, as well as being supported by Irish Heritage Québec. And it's really thanks to Irish Heritage Québec to have provided us with all of the tools required to make this video. And a special thank you to Mark Hughes from the board on Irish Heritage Québec, who's here actually with all of this equipment to make this happen. We're going to talk about two events that occurred here years ago. One that was referred to as the Ferguson Fire, with a question mark because it ended up being far more complicated than that. And the second one is just the Sheridan tragedy, the Sheridan saga. I put a note on this slide talking about a warning that it's a little bit difficult. The reason why these stories are a bit difficult because there's some children involved. So if you're a bit squeamish, I would suggest you probably stop now before you listen to all of them. But there's real value in saving the stories. The sign that you see on the left of the dark green is a sign that we've put up on a piece of the original Craigs Road that we've had the town of St. Sylvester declare a historical site. We have about 200 meters and it's the proper size. It's only 15 to 18 feet wide and it gives a descriptor of it. So we just decided to share that picture with you in case you never get a chance to come out here. So without further ado, we'll get on with the presentation and start with the first story. The Ferguson Fire and First Nations. When we first heard this story, it was all about a fire. It was quite a little bit confusing. But before we get to the actual event, just a quick view as to what the time frame was and what was going on here at the time. This is a slide that I've used before to describe the opening up of the territory. Quebec City is Quebec City, and the river is up on the top right-hand side of your slide. And this original road, the Craigs Road, this one here with the red light, was in fact put in place in 1810. But with the War of 1812, it sort of went into disrepute. And nobody really is living for a good 15, 16 miles from that point where you see the red dot, which is basically at the beginning of St. Sylvester. There's no one on either side of that. There are a few Americans way over here on this side, on the left-hand side, around St. Ferdinand of Halifax, a few Americans, and then basically blank all the way through to St. Gilles, which is up in this general area. And the blue spot right in the middle is where this Ferguson story occurs. The first family that actually arrives here is a family named Ferguson. And they're literally the first. So there's nobody here other than a chap named Archibald McLean, who's sort of like a coureur de bois. He's here and he's not here. And this Ferguson family, they're cousins of Archibald's, but they're the first ones that are permanent. And in 1818, the tragedy strikes. What's frustrating at times, but also intriguing at times, is there was an oral tradition about this story. It was a written tradition, but there was always a puzzle that remained. So and this is really a review of what that puzzle was and how we figured out what actually did happen. In 1812, Archibald McLean is floating around helping the British to do some work on the War of 1812. And in this book called The Annals of Meganic, which is probably our best actual review of early settlement in the area. It's done by a guy named Dougal McKillop in 1906, and he tells the story of the Ferguson family who are killed by an Abenaki who literally kills the father and the 4 children with a tomahawk. He puts the house on fire, he buries the bodies, and they rob, he and his wife, or he and his squaw as he calls them, rob a child and they take off. And the story, according to the annals, is that they're eventually captured in New Brunswick and the male Indian is hanged. We have no idea what the names of the family are. We have no idea what happened to the child that was supposedly abducted. And the only other reference that is made in the story is that, in fact, some other neighbors at the distant end of near St. Ferdinand, where some of those Americans were, some of them saw some of Ferguson's clothing on some of the Indians in the area. So it's a 1912 story according to the annals. And what I found frustrating is for years I was trying to find the facts around this. And I spent literally years between looking up articles from 1812 to 1813, 14, 15, and never got anywhere. I was in the process of thinking it was really just oral tradition, and it was wrong. That was my original impression. And then what happened is I stumbled upon a map that was done by a guy named Charles Fournier in December 1818. And his map covers the Craigs Road all the way from its opening up at the in Saint-Gilles all the way to Richmond. And what's fascinating about his map is he drew little houses where they actually existed, and he identifies a few things. And in that map, I noticed that it's marked Ferguson, meaning Ferguson. And he also wrote Maison Brûlée. So it was the first indication that I had something that actually proved, other than the oral tradition, that Ferguson fire or something with the Ferguson family had actually occurred. And it allowed me to start backing up as to when this may have occurred. And finally, I found an article in the Quebec Mercury dated March 24, 1818. And in that, it talked about this house fire and Neil Ferguson. So for the first time, we have a name, and he talks about the wife and children being killed, but it's all built around the fire, thus the original term, the Ferguson fire. The barn and stable apparently were still okay. The animals were moved by some people who came by and moved them to safer grounds. There's no mention of any Indians, no mention of any murder in this story, other than calling it a melancholy accident in 1818. What it also allowed me to do is, now that I had Neil's name, I was able to look and see if there was any records as to who the family might have been. And for the first time, we found out that his wife's name was, in fact, Catherine. He was living in Quebec City in 1811, and he was noted as a farmer in Leeds, 1813. And we got that literally out of the church records at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Quebec City, and it tells us that Anne was born in 1811, Margaret in 1813, Alexander in 1815, and there's a fourth older boy. So the reference to the 4 children being killed, that's the 4 children. What's strange about the story is it was almost like a sputtering story that we found out information. Other than that original newspaper article, within about 2 to 3 weeks, we see a letter coming from a gentleman named John McLean, who lived in that St. Ferdinand area over on the left-hand side of that prior map, right to George Stoken, one of the gentlemen in closer to Leeds, closer to St. Gilles, that actually helped come and clean up the mess and move the cattle. And in that, he refers to the fact that the people in St. Ferdinand think that there were some Indians that actually killed them, because there was far too much evidence of clothing and some rumors in the locale that perhaps that Ferguson was not just burnt in a fire, but in fact it was something a lot more aggressive, and there was probably some killing by a certain Indian, specifically an Abenaki from the St. Ferdinand area. And then the story in 1818 sort of dies out. Despite all of that activity, it looks like nothing really happened. And there's, in the archives, what I found then was another kick-up or a start-up of the story, and it's tied to another murder that occurs in 1826 in St. Mary de Beauce. And in that specific case, the Taschereau, the Justice of the Peace, starts poking around, and one of the Indians involved in that case came from that St. Ferdinand area again. And then there's a series of records of depositions done in 1827, again in that St. Ferdinand area, done by a gentleman named Captain Amos Hall, who's a pretty bigger-than-life character that's been in the area since about 1807, 1808. And he has a number of interventions with various people in the area, and again, a lot of suspicion, but no obvious action. One person's name that comes up constantly in some of the interviews and depositions is an Indian, an Abenaki named Stanislaus, and his spouse. And Stanislaus is walking around with a lot of Ferguson's clothing on him. So somehow that story, though, honestly, sort of disappears. And again, one more time, it's like it was very hard trying to put all of the pieces together to get a clear idea of who is doing what to whom. This idea of the Abenaki base camp in St. Ferdinand is the purple circle on your left-hand side of the screen. When I started doing some work on that Abenaki group, what I found was there's a pretty militant or a pretty violent group there. A guy named Noel, who's involved with that appears in some of the depositions taken by Captain Amos Hall, he ends up by being hanged in Trois-Rivières for the killing of Antoine Dubuc around land issues. Another case of Joachim or Swachine was identified and attached to the murder that I talked about in Saint-Méry-de-Beauce. Two others, Alexander Sandcaster and John Ornay, whose names appear again in those depositions, they're both accused of killing two Americans in the area. Both of them end up by getting exiled. And finally, they identify again Stanislaus being the one that is the most likely to have done the actual murder. And there's reference to him actually having died a natural causes. So somehow all of these people all seem to be involved in this one little band of about 15 or 20 people in St. Ferdinand that all appear to have this very violent tendency. Now, I put a caution here on purpose because one of the things that was difficult in putting these names together is there's multiple spellings of these Joachim, Swachine, Sandcaster, Ornay. There's two or three Joseph Ornays. I'm assuming that all of them are the Ornays of that area. So there's a little bit of caution around the name, but obviously it appears that this band was rather aggressive. It was only much later that the finger pointing and the story sort of clarifies and gives a different context to what we thought actually occurred, rather than McKillop's view that it was a violent attack just on Ferguson and his family. There's a report done in 1996, not 1896, 1996, by a consultant, Stone. And one of the things that's interesting, it points firmly and clarifies that Stanislaus was the killer. I mean, there was no doubt about it. Stanislaus and his wife were both killed, but they died natural causes. What's interesting about it is, in her description of the time, is she brings the context of the timing. At the time, the government, and again, this is this time between 1818 and 1825, which is the timetable that, to me, it looked very much fuzzy and complex in terms of trying to understand who is doing what to whom. She very clearly explains that this is a time when the government is looking at a policy of appeasing some of the natives. As the natives were losing their land and their hunting rights, and the whites were coming into their territory, they were looking for a balance of how do we allow the whites to come in and not be too aggressive. So they got into a position of where they were actually, and the term they use as a policy is, we will give you presents if you leave the white settlers alone and if you move into areas, i.e. meaning into reserves. So that context is a little bit different. As I mentioned, the Ferguson family is the first permanent settlement right in the middle of their seasonal hunting grounds. So it just gives a different story. And then it also opens up the question was this just one aggressive small band sitting in the area and that being the exception? Or was there something about saving their own turf, trying to assure that not too many white people came to the area at the time? Because you have to remember the Abenaki had already been moved out of Maine and New Hampshire into this general area, and there's a series of examples where the white population certainly didn't treat them very well and didn't respect their land rights. So there's a land right issue here which is very, very different. So this influx of Europeans sort of puts a different spin onto the story. So were they aggressive? Were they not aggressive? That's a really good question that one has to question. There's no doubt, though, that Ferguson and his wife and children were killed and in the area. So the story also gives us a few lessons and contradictions. So the McKillop story was wrong on the timing. He was a few years off. On the kidnapping of a child, that never occurred. The number of children, he added up to 5, there were only 4. The public hanging of the Indian never occurred. There was another hanging, but not of this one. There was a trial in New Brunswick, didn't occur. So somehow that MacKillop story, while it was based on a fair amount of facts, there was also a fair amount of errors in the telling of the story. The other interesting about MacKillop is he goes out of his way to talk how the Abenaki were helpful to the Scott arrival in 1829 to 31 time period, and it's a very different mentality and cooperation versus this saga around the Fergusons. So it was maybe just a question of the Indians or the Abenaki deciding that there's a critical mass now, I can't come across hundreds of people that are here versus one individual. So it's a difficult question. The other thing that from stepping back and looking at the story, there's little doubt that while the judiciary and the government in place is trying to push settlement into the area, you can be sure that the killing of the first family in the area certainly didn't encourage people to show up, and certainly did act as a deterrent. So if that was part of the strategy of Stanislaus or some of these First Nation people, then they would probably, at least if nothing else, delayed the influx of people. The other thing it also did was understands the limit of oral tradition, even when it's written. In the case of MacKillop, what we found was that MacKillop didn't get this firsthand. He got it from somebody who told him the story, who got it from their parents. Their parents arrived in 1830, some 20 years after this actual event. So even if it's written, be cautious with the telling of the stories. Some other lessons that we learned from this. Evidence of a First Nations seasonal camp on the Palmer River. So for people in our area that know where the Palmer River is, where Wilson's Mill is, this confirms that there was in fact a seasonal base for the Abenaki at the time. The challenges of house building. In the whole story at the beginning, when we're thinking about, or when they were thinking about it being strictly a fire, one of Ferguson's cousins talks about the challenges he had of building a chimney, and he frequently had chimney fires. And there seems to be a whole issue at the time around how big a house you could build, and how was it, the challenges building around chimneys. They finally settled on houses that were about 18 by 18 feet, and that seemed to be the ideal, with a little bit more construction proper around the chimney. There's also evidence of ongoing trade with the First Nations, with little nervousness, all the way through the exercise that Captain Amos Hall has in terms of depositions. There's frequent reference to locals exchanging and trading with the local Indians, even when both parties were armed. So somehow there was some activity where there seems to be a reasonableness that occurred between the two parties. Also evidence of moving cattle up and down the road, because the original people that found the fire and found that the Ferguson family had been killed were people that were coming from the St. Ferdinand area, and they were moving cattle towards Quebec. It also confirms the Palmer House Hotel, which went up in 1811, had a very short lifespan. So this happens in 1818, and yet people are stopping at Ferguson's for lunches when in fact the Palmer Hotel was there, but had been abandoned about 3-4 years before. And the other one has, again, one more time, my reference to being cautious about the sources. I'm cautious about facts, rumors, and opinions. And oral tradition sort of is a fluid thing between them all. So even if it's written, be careful with the sources. So that's the story of the Ferguson Fire, or the Ferguson Massacre, depending on what word you want to use. It happened in 1818, and the family that currently lives there had no clue as to what had occurred on their land until such time as I explained it to them very quietly. Thank you very much. That's the story of the Fergusons. So the next story we're going to take a look at is a sad Sheridan saga. This was found by a little bit by chance, but we were able to narrow in on it fairly quickly. This is a case of somebody contacting me at the time living in Edmonton, whose ancestors came from this general area. He didn't know me, I didn't know him, but he said, "I hear you know something about the area. My ancestors were in St. Sylvester, moved to the St. Ferdinand area, and I see records in the church records of 2 coroners' reports, and I don't understand it." So there were 2 cases within weeks of each other. One is this is a terrible thing, a rather routine murder, which isn't too exciting. That's not the one we're going to talk about tonight. The second one was a little more sad, and that's the one we're talking about here. And he just asked the question, had you ever heard anything about it? So my first query was to some of the people at the National Archives in Quebec and Trois-Rivières, and neither one had ever heard of this. So they were fascinated when I went back with what I found out. But because we had a church record where we could zero in on the timing very, very quickly. And this is the headline that came out of an October 23rd, 1863 headline in the Quebec Morning Chronicle. Horrible massacre by a maniac. So it's a pretty straightforward line. There's very little judgment as to, or very little doubt as to the conclusion of the person who heard about this story made about what actually occurred. The family involved is James Sheridan and Mary Clark. Now, James Sheridan married Mary in 1842 in St. Sylvester, but they were of Halifax Township. So Halifax Township is just about the area of St. Ferdinand, Halifax, so it's a little bit west of here. But in that time period, the priest at the time was Father James Nelligan, who was also did some time in Quebec City at St. Patrick's and some time in St. Joseph de Beauce, but he was here for a lot of years in St. Sylvester. And in the 1840s, his influence and his territory included St. Ferdinand. So he married James, who was a son of Edward and Mary Carey of County Mayo, married Mary Clark, who was the daughter of James Clark and Mary Kelly. And between the 1840s, the early 1840s and early 1860s, they had 9 children. But it was a troubled situation. Mary had ongoing mental challenges, and at the time, not well known by myself, we found that she spent an awful lot of time in either prison at the time or at the asylum in Beauport. So we have multiple examples of her being charged with or accused of either being insane or insane and dangerous. This is one document that we found, one of several that refers to it, whereas her husband, James, goes to the courts to try to get her placed. In this particular case, she had just finished staying 4 months at the asylum in Beauport, and that ended in September 1863. She comes home, and on October 19th, 20th, she kills 4 of her children. She didn't flee. She met the neighbors, went out, and openly talked that she did it. There was no question. It was just a pure killing of her children. Her husband, James, had been gone away for one day to visit a sister who lived in Somerset. So Somerset would be about the Plessisville area, for those of you that know the area. So probably about half a day distance from St. Ferdinand. So he had gone for a day, and upon his return, a number of neighbors met him on the road and told him to beware, what to expect. His wife was sitting on the roadside, full of blood, and he's the one that ends up by identifying his 4 children: William 5, Sarah 2 months, Margaret 14, and Mary 8, who had all been murdered by the wife. All of the neighbors had circled around to try to make sure that Mary didn't escape. She was going nowhere. She had no intention of going anywhere, and wanted to be in position to help James cope with his arrival. The coroner's inquest, this is a copy of the summary. It's a pretty graphic read. It's very long with a number of witnesses. She bludgeoned them with a hatchet, and it was so it's a pretty nasty description all the way through. And she had no qualms whatsoever about it. She just did it. And the inquest also details a number of versions of how James reacted to his wife and how some of the neighbors helped manage James. There was an insinuation that James was going to go after the wife. So there's a pretty tense and ugly situation. Bottom line was Mary, not having tried to escape, was basically sent to prison, and she was sent to prison to await trial. This is the Arthabaska prison where she spent some time. The building is partially there today, but it was quite very much in use all the way through the time period that we're talking about. The trial was in November of '63, and John O'Farrell, who also had connections both to St. Sylvester and Quebec City, was the lawyer involved trying to manage the situation for Mary. And he intervenes, interesting enough. I found a document where the court was trying to get Mary to describe whether she felt she was guilty or not guilty. And O'Farrell intervened, saying she's not in a position to make a decision, she's insane. So his interflection or his intervention was significant in getting the court to agree with him. In fact, Mary clearly claimed that the reason why she got out was because she had promised that if she did get out from the asylum, that she would make a sacrifice of some of her children. So, I mean, there was pretty little evidence that she was totally sane. So O'Farrell was able to get her confirmed that she was insane, and she was remained in prison for another few months until December, and then sent back to the lunatic asylum in Beauport, and a return visit of which she would never be able to get out again. So she was sent back. So terrible tragedy. But the tragedy didn't end there. So on January 30, 1875, there's a major fire on Ward 9, the eastern wing of the asylum in Beauport. 420 women are on site at the time. The initial indication that there were probably 3 people that died in the fire. It was purposely set by one individual. The coroner Prendergast in February 1875 lists 26 people. One of them is inmate 1071, Mary Clark. So it's a terrible ending to a terrible story. And again, one more time, this story doesn't end there. So I started looking to find out what happened to James and his kids, the ones that still remained alive. In the 1871 census, so this is some years later, he's still identified as being in the area where his wife had killed the children. And James Jr., Delia, and Dennis are still with him in Ireland Township. And I had no idea what had happened to these people other than that. And I wrote a book or a chapter in a book concerning this story, and that's more or less where the story ended. And then a few months later, in April 2017, a friend of mine, one of our members from Washington State, sent me a note saying, I found him, and this is the date, and this is the document of James's demise. They found James buried at the asylum in June '75, a few months after Mary's death. He had become a patient at the asylum. So after her death and the number of years that he had spent with her, the children who were killed, and her death, he became a patient in the asylum. And he died there and is buried there at the asylum as well. So that's rather sad. Now this is 2017. So for the last X number of years, every once in a while, I start looking for what happened to the rest of the kids. And then in March 2025, I finally stumbled on one of them. What happened to the 3 kids? There's a few references to them in the US, but nothing specific. And then in March 2025 of this year, I found a death certificate for Delia Sheridan McCaffrey in Seattle of stomach cancer. And she's the daughter of James and Mary, and we found a marriage record to a McCaffrey at the time. And here's the note. Last 2 years she spent at Kings County Almshouse for people who could not look after themselves, poor, elderly, disabled, or with mental health issues. And when I saw that, I just sort of cringed, thinking, here's one more case of a rather sad story. And as I said, it just seemed to get worse. This story just ended. Now, what happened to the other 2 boys? I have no clue. So if anybody ever finds anything about James Jr. or Dennis, I'd much appreciate getting a hold of it. But this, again, also indicates some of the people locally ended up on the far west coast in that point in time. So they could be anywhere in North America. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So there you go. That's the story of the Sheridan story. And it's very sad. And one of the reflections I had after thinking about it, I thought about what it must have been like for James's mother, who was still alive. So all the way through this, James's father had passed away before this event, but his mom, Catherine Carey, was still alive. So she had to live through all of this. And what hit me was they came from County Mayo. Well, if you came from County Mayo and you were born in 1790, you lived through all the atrocities of the landing of the French in 1798. Mayo was decimated, incredibly violent place. To think that they got out of there, came here, and yet her story and her sadness must have just been one level after another all the way through this. So a very difficult time. So there's the story of the Sheridans. Rather sad. The land involved, I was able to find where it occurred, and it's sort of on a piece of land that looks like something on the handkerchief for St. Margaret's and St. Sylvester. Today it's in the middle of nowhere, basically bush area, but at the time it was fully populated. So that's the story of the Sheridans. Thank you very much.